Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you happen to be. This is Firoz Manji from Daraja Press. Welcome to Organizing in the Time of COVID. There are many books written about mining and its particularly about its destructive effects. But there are actually very few books that are written by organizers that speak on how to challenge mining companies profiteering directly and challenging the exploitation of communities, which expose the deceitful political maneuvering that these companies engage in to avoid fulfilling obligations such as the obligation for full and free informed consent where they're operating. In my view, the best of these books has been written by a woman called Joan Kuyek, a community-focused mining analyst and organizer who happens to live here in Ottawa. She was the founding national coordinator of MiningWatch Canada from 1999 to 2009 and continues to do work with MiningWatch and for a number of communities affected by mining. She recently published a book, Unearthing Justice: How to Protect Your Community from the Mining Industry, published by Between the Lines here in Toronto. In this book, she shares with readers her experience of many decades of working with communities, including with Indigenous communities here in Canada. This is an exceptionally useful book for anyone, anywhere, who is seeking justice and dignity in the face of the destructive effect of mining ventures. I was particularly keen to have Joan on the show because her work with at Mining Watch Canada has pointed out that these companies that amputate natural resources in Canada are the same ones we face across Africa and indeed in Latin America, Asia, and across the global south. So this book is more than about just Canada. The book is one that should be in the hands of all those who seek to take on the might of the transnational corporations of the ground. But today, communities across the world face not only the avarice of mining companies, but also the pandemic of COVID-19, which poses new challenges for organizing in a time of COVID. So welcome to the show, dear Joan. It's really a pleasure to have you here with us.
Well, I'm pleased to be asked.
Oh, that's great. I thought it'd be quite helpful for people to get a sense of, there's no alternative to reading the book, but but at least to get an introduction to it. What does mining look like in reality? There's a lot of mythology in development that this is an essential part of development. What does it actually look like?
Well, actually, it is probably an essential part of development as development is commonly understood, which is about transforming the natural world into capital. So the first thing about mining in Canada and most other parts of the world is that it is sort of the ultimate expression of colonial violence. It intrudes and walks into the lives of the people who've always lived there and takes the resource, turns something that's there into a resource, into something that can be traded as a commodity that can be measured in dollars, and takes it away and leaves behind an enormous amount of waste and damage, and generally has resulted in the marginalization and often the extermination of the very people who lived there before. So the history of mining in Canada or in South America, Central America, or in countries in Africa, or even in Asia, is one of extraction, of destruction, and of the changing of something in the natural environment into a commodity. And these days, one of the most obvious ones is gold. So, for example, in the Yukon, 120 years ago, there was a gold rush Miners rushed in from all over the place to the Klondike. In 2 years, took out billions of dollars worth of gold in today's dollars, and left behind people who were devastated by this and had to rebuild their whole society now around the extraction of gold. And that's happened many places. Gold, as we all know, has no real value. It's something that it has value because it's used for jewelry. It's hoarded. It's used as a secure against currencies, and it creates enormous problems for people where it's being extracted. Diamonds are the same, artificially created value. It's you can't eat it, you can't build houses with it, you can't do anything with it. The industrial uses of gold and diamonds are very, very small, but they become the basis of whole economies. In Ghana, people mined gold for 4,000 to 5,000 years before the big companies came in and started scooping it all out in 10. So that's the first part about mining. The second thing about mining, I guess, is that it's a waste management industry. The amount of metal that's extracted is going to be probably less than 1%, almost always less than 1% of the stuff that's taken out to get it. So you'll have the soil and the trees and so on removed. They call that overburden. Then you have the waste rock removed, the rock where there is no metal that you want. And then you'll have the ore removed, and the ore is where the metal you want is. All of that is smashed up, smashed to smithereens, set aside, and the gold or the copper or the nickel or the uranium is taken out and processed and sold. The rest of it is left behind forever. And in most cases, what's left behind is going to be toxic. It can't be fixed. It's got to be contained. So
when you say it's toxic, what are you talking about?
Well, when you smash up rock, our rocks contain, around here, for example, uranium. They contain lead and arsenic and stuff like that in the rock. But it's bound to the rock. But when you smash it up and it's exposed to air and water, those metals begin to leach into the water table. And they create, if it's acidic, if it's got sulfur in the rock, like most of ours do, then you're going to get something called acid mine drainage. But you can also get leachate in neutral rocks. So when it's smashed up and exposed to air and water, it starts to leach into the water table and creates a dynamic where it takes with it the chemicals that are in the rock. So you might have arsenic leaching, you might have nickel, copper, radioactive leaching. So there's a whole problem with this rock that ends up being now available, I suppose, to the atmosphere, and it creates a situation where you have to contain and prevent the access of air and water to these smashed up rocks forever. Now, we can't even keep the potholes out of our roads for a year, so you can understand what the problem is. So people who live in South Africa, for example, beside these huge heaps of rock that were smashed up to get gold, are dealing with radioactivity. They're dealing with blowing dust from the tailings piles. In places where they've put the smashed up ore, the tailings, in underwater or it's wet, then you have leaching into the water table as well as dust. So the whole areas, whole aquifers are poisoned by mining, and we don't pay attention to it. In recent years, there's been a lot more attention paid to tailings because there's been some really horrific disasters, such as the ones at the Vale tailings impoundments in Brazil at Brumadinho and the Samarco tailings dam, and people have died. They've poisoned rivers, they've killed fish, they've displaced whole communities. And in South Africa, this is a really, really serious problem. And it's a problem in Canada. So we need to pay much more attention to that. So not only do you have the colonial assault, do you have these toxins and they're huge pits, like pits can be 4 kilometers across these days.
Wow.
And the tailings impound is going to be bigger because that's where they put the stuff that was in the pit. But you also have a huge effect on governance because mining turns into a commodity. These things that were just there before. At the point where a mine goes into production, there's an enormous influx of wealth. And the people who own the mines want to get as much out of it as they possibly can and leave as little behind as they possibly can. And the effect of that is a lot of corruption, a lot of investment agreements that basically screw the countries where the mines are, or the provinces or the territories. In the Yukon, there's been placer mining for 122 years. The gold royalty that was paid by the placer miners last year in 2017 was $28,000. That's it. Large companies pay very small royalties. They've usually managed to affect the way laws and regulations are written so that they're protected. So now in the time of COVID, gold mining in almost every province and territory in Canada is considered an essential service. Like, how can that be? We don't need gold. Any of the gold we need for medical equipment and so on could be got from, our cell phones. But it's considered an essential service because they've made local governments and local communities so dependent on the jobs.
But first question. People argue, well, at least they're providing jobs.
Yeah.
Isn't that a good thing?
Well, there's nothing wrong with providing jobs, and I'm not certainly arguing that they should just pull up stakes and get out of there right now, because people have become dependent on those jobs. Whole towns have been built around the mine. So Sudbury, where I lived for 30 years, is still actually almost totally dependent on the mines and smelters that are there, because that's how the town was created.
But given the sort of profits that are made, why is it that these companies are not made to pay for the waste disposal?
Well, it's a question of power, as you know. Think about it. The town or the province in Canada grew up around mining. The settlers came in, they worked in the mines, they established their governments, they established the systems of extraction, the railroads, the roads, everything was built to service the mining company. So the people who were originally there, who depended on other things in the natural world, are displaced, dispossessed, marginalized. And the people who've come in as settlers have their discourse and their way of thinking shaped by the mining industry. So the power of the industry in terms of shaping law, regulation, and especially tax policy is enormous. And there's a lot of myths propagated by the industry about how much it contributes in taxes and royalties and so on, when in fact it contributes very, very little. In some places, companies are able to develop a balance sheet that shows that all they have is losses. They can count exploration for more mineral deposits in other places as an expense on a mine's balance sheet, for example. So a company like Goldcorp, Newmont, will build a mine. It costs a lot to get it started, mind you. They get it started, they start making huge profits. Then they go and they start looking for other mines. All the expenses looking for those other mines are considered a deduction on their ledger for tax purposes. So the more they look for other mines, the less profit they have. Sometimes they leverage the mine they've got to take out a loan to look for another mine or develop another mine. That reduces the balance on their accounts, and the result is that they pay almost no tax or no royalties. Some of the bilateral trade agreements Canada has with other countries allow them to bring almost all the profits home if there are any. So it's just they shape the law and the regulation and the tax system. If people become dependent on the jobs. So once the mine is operating, they're afraid to criticize the company because the company will say, well, we can go elsewhere. They can't necessarily, but that's what they say. And
so how do communities organize?
Well, it depends what stage things are at.
Right.
Like increasingly now, people know what the consequences of having mines are. Mm-hmm. So they fight like hell to stop them in the first place. That's one thing. If you're going to stop it before it starts, right, you've got a better chance. And there's a whole lot of wonderful stories of land defenders and water protectors stopping mines from coming into their communities, or at least mitigating the impacts to some extent. If the mine is operating, it's so hard to do anything because they will say, we're going to take the jobs and run. If we don't get this water permit to dump waste into the river, then we're not going to be able to continue. Increasingly, this is a problem. And certainly in countries like Zambia, this has been or Tanzania, this has been awful in terms of people trying to stop things. It's a problem here too. Teck has coal mines in British Columbia that are leaching selenium into the waters and killing fish. People would like very much to have that stop. Most people want coal mining to stop, but there's a lot of jobs involved, so people don't know how to fight it. The community gets very divided fighting it. One of the tools to try and stop pollution from operating mines is these risk assessments, but nobody understands them in the local community. And frankly, almost all of them end up saying that there's no immediate danger from the mines. And they're a tool that's used by the industry to obfuscate what they're doing. If the mine is closing, and increasingly that's the case because most mines only last 10 to 15 years, what the company does is start looking for other deposits in the area. And again, people sometimes stop that, but often by this point, they're dependent on the mine and it's hard to do it. And then it's over and the community finds itself having to fight to get it cleaned up and taken care of properly over time. So the people fight back in very different ways. They fight back around trying to get tailings dealt with, to get the violence to stop. They fight back in trying to get a bigger share of the pie from an existing mine. And that stuff is often that's all you can do is trying to get a bigger share of the pie. But it's their financial accounts are so complicated, it's often very, very difficult to do it. And to do that, you need to have government on your side. And so, really, a lot of dealing with operating in closed mines is trying to get the government to work with and for you because nobody in the local community has the resources to deal with that level of power. So it's this usual battle of the people trying to get their own government under control. And that's, we all know what that battle's like.
You've talked really about minerals. It's the same situation you face in relation to the extraction of oil.
Yes.
Are there particular dimensions that are?
Well, I haven't been very much engaged with oil and fossil fuel extraction, Feroz, and there are a lot of similarities. In Canada, we didn't do that because the legal structures are different for fossil fuels than they are for mining. And frankly, we were such a small organization, we could hardly deal with what we had. But yeah, it's the same. It's extraction. And so you're transforming something in the natural landscape into a commodity and taking it out and to hell with whatever happens to the rest of it.
Right.
And that kind of extractivist economy is what's killing us now, really. It displaces wildlife. We have industrial agriculture that's a form of extractivism too.
Indeed.
We mine soil and we mine beings to get the food we need. So there's that mentality has got to stop. I mean, it's where the problem is, and we need to be respecting what's there and how we build respect. And I think to a very large extent, I mean, it so permeates our culture. It's really, and most cultures now, it's so hard to get past that. And people are so desperate for some share of the wealth. I mean, mining and other forms of extractivism are just creating terrible devastation in all parts of the world. They're impoverishing people. They're being displaced to slums. Those images of people walking back from the slums in Mumbai to their communities in the face of COVID are heartbreaking. But they're in Mumbai because they've been displaced from Maharashtra state through the dams and the industrial agriculture and the mines. That's why they're there. So, those kinds of deep questions are hard.
I think it's really important what you raised about the parallels with industrial agriculture, because both involve the poisoning of the soil. But I think there's another connection which Rob Wallace helped us to understand was that all of this involves deforestation. It involves not just agricultural products and poisoning of the land, but a lot of this agriculture is for livestock production.
Yeah.
And it is there that because of the deforestation, the potential really increases of the production of zoonotic effects. In other words,
Yeah.
the transmission of viruses which affect animals going across to humans. And here we are with COVID.
Yeah.
And so what is happening? What's the effect? What are the issues that are arising in terms of communities facing not just this sort of violence of exploitation of natural resources, but also of the threat of the pandemic?
Well, there's a few things. One is that the people who own these mining companies or the industrial agriculture companies or fossil fuel companies are really seeing our isolation and our fear as an opportunity to start trashing environmental laws and regulations that people have fought for decades now. They see it as an opportunity to override all the land and water protectors who have organized to try and change this. They see our inability to get into the streets as a chance to do a whole lot of things. So in Ontario, the province I live in, the government has, not been too bad, I suppose, in terms of imposing social isolation on everybody. But they've just removed the requirement to report to the Environmental Bill of Rights if you're going to undertake a new activity. They have declared gold an essential service. They're talking about sending subsidies to mining companies that are suffering through all this. It's quite unbelievable for the people who work in these mines. They say they can't socially isolate. It's impossible. It's too crowded and it's too difficult. at the Lac des Îles mine that's owned by Impala Canada in northwestern Ontario. There's now 20 cases of COVID. Increasingly, people in these mines are finding that the workers are finding that their health is being affected. The communities where these mines are very, very concerned because a lot of the workers are contract workers who fly in and fly out, and then travel on buses. They often have man camps where there's a lot of mingling and a lot of danger to the surrounding community. So the impact. The other thing that's happening to the companies is that their supply chains are seriously disrupted. A lot of them sell to China, and a lot of them depend on equipment that came from different parts of the world, and their supply chains are seriously disrupted. They can't get what they need. And so a lot of them are in serious trouble because they're so globalized. And they're globalized in terms of what they need daily to keep their mines operating. They're disrupted because their workers, especially their highly skilled workers, are often being imported from other countries and traveling back and forth. In Canada, one of the first big COVID events actually was the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada meeting in Toronto the first weekend in March. 25,000 people from all over the world came, a number of them from Indigenous communities in Canada that they use it as a big sales pitch event. Everybody mingles, they drink a lot, they shake hands, they're very social event. And there has been some COVID that was found in people after that event. Who knows to what extent the COVID that's spreading around the world was fostered by the PDAC conference. And that's, only very few people in mining can actually work from home. They need to be on the site. And in the global south, that's an even bigger issue because it's much more labor intensive than it is in the north.
So people who work in the mines, because it's considered an essential service, are in essence being considered as disposable since they cannot exercise social distancing.
Well, in Canada, if you're unionized, 45% of workers here are, you should be able to refuse unsafe work.
And are there examples of that?
Yeah, there are. But what's happened in BC at Teck is that the Steelworkers Union has negotiated for better conditions, but to keep working because they want the jobs. They're high-paying jobs. They don't want to be without them. There have been a number of places now where workers have walked out to protest the situation. There's been a few where local communities have blocked access to the mine. In Nunavut, Rankin Inlet did that. But the stories are not getting out very well. Quite frankly, it's really hard to get information about what's actually going on the ground around the world. And in most places, nobody's keeping track. Like there's such limited health facilities in most of these places where the mines are that people are probably sick and dying at home, but they're not getting counted because there's no testing. And in places where there's unions, in Canada at least, a lot of them don't want the information getting out about COVID. And they're, basically conspiring with the company to keep it.
Why?
Well, they want the jobs. And so they've become dependent on the jobs. There's this whole discourse around panic. Let's not create panic. Panic meaning people would want to do something. So it's really hard to know, and what the media reports on is pretty slim too. So we're finding that it's very hard to get information about what's actually going on. Ecuador, for example, is being hammered by COVID. They have no idea how many people are actually dying of COVID and how many are dying of related health issues that they can't get treated, but they think it's 3 to 5 times more than the amount being reported. The deaths are off the charts. Mining and fossil fuel production are huge issues there. I was looking around this morning, and there's reports of pipelines breaking. I don't know what that's all about. I haven't heard it. So it's becoming increasingly difficult to find out what's actually going on. It's one of the reasons why this broadcast is so important, because you're talking to people who may know. Like when you first asked me, I was hesitant to talk because I don't really know. I'm not in mining communities. If I'm in a mining community, I'd probably know less. I'd probably know less.
Goodness me.
You listen to our broadcast of the CBC these days. All they talk about is COVID, but quite frankly, you don't find out anything.
Yes.
You don't really know what's going on and how many people aren't counted, how are people coping, what are people doing when they're told to self-isolate at home and they may be dying, right? What happens if you live in a slum in downtown Toronto with 5 kids and an abusive husband and you can't get out? What happens if you're a Syrian refugee? We're not getting that information, and we're going to get less of it. We're going to get less.
And I think that's same internationally. I think that there are massive refugee camps. There are massive slums in most of the African cities, and unfortunately, what is happening is that social distancing is being interpreted as an excuse for keeping the plebs away from the middle classes, because in these
that's what it does, actually.
Yes, and so there's a militarization of the streets as well.
Oh yeah, it's
the
terrible.
Police are out there, and it's a really serious situation. I mean, are we seeing that kind of militarization happening, that sort of increased presence of the police and armed police on the streets?
Well, here I am. I'm isolated in my lovely little house in the middle of downtown Ottawa. Yeah. What do I know? But from what I can see, yeah, that's what's happening. Like parts of New York, for example, which is very close to us, where all the people work who are Black, Brown, Latino, and Asian, are still having to work, are still cooped up in these houses. They can't socially distance. There's no friggin' way they can do that.
Yeah.
And so the people who have the resources can socially distance. And Galbraith talks a lot about, and when he wrote about the middle class and how it's the middle class wanted more than anything in North America to have contentment. And part of contentment was that you didn't know what was going on in what he called the underclass. So there was the contented white middle class, and maybe with a few brown people scattered in there. And then there's this whole other layer of people, the majority, that are the underclass. And they're impoverished, they're desperate, and they do all the real work in the society, and nobody wants to hear about it. And increasingly, that's what you see, because the more you hear about the underclass, the more it disrupts the comfort of the middle class. And I think that what we're seeing is increasing militarization and control of the underclass, as they call it. And there has been some of the middle class, but frankly, it's not a terrible hardship for most of us. And so I don't know how you organize in that, Feroz. I have no idea how people organize when the price of being together in the streets is is probably terrible illness. Now, maybe people have been doing that all along. Like I keep thinking, well, that's true for malaria. It's true for terrible hunger. It's been true in the times of typhus and cholera. And I think, I'm not a person who's going to be able to tell people how to do this now. The people who can answer these questions are the people who've lived through those apocalypses already. So in Canada, that's the Indigenous people here. I mean, they went through wave after wave of epidemics that knocked out 90% of the people, like almost every 40 years. The people we have around us are people who have survived waves of epidemics almost every 30 to 40 years for 200 years now, 300 years.
This is
smallpox,
apocalyptic generations.
Yeah, the settlers who came here got sick too, but not on that extent. And they certainly, the Irish who came here were basically wiped out before they turned up, and they got cholera again when they came. The people who built the Rideau Canal died of malaria.
Right.
Like I think we need, and we all lived through the AIDS epidemic. And I know an awful lot of people, including some very dear people to me who died at that time. So I think we need to sort of figure this one out. And it's different because this one is a little different because you can't see, taste, or smell it, right? Like it creeps up on you. It's people are supposedly communicating it when they're not symptomatic. So it frightens people a great deal. It's very frightening. It's an invisible force, something out of a horror movie. But I think I'm always disturbed by how much maybe this is. I'm distrustful, I think, of what we're being told, and because I'm distrustful, but I don't have the skills to figure it all out. I don't half the time even know who to believe, right? It's very, very confusing.
Yeah. I mean, I think, one of the characteristics of Canada is as a colony being a colonial power as well. And if one looks at what has happened to Indigenous people in this country, you see the parallels with colonialism right on our doorstep.
Yeah.
But as you point out, these are the post-apocalyptic generations, and I think maybe this maybe an opportunity to open up a discussion about what we can learn from their experiences. Many of them are under conditions where the social distancing is not a realistic possibility. And there's the example of Bolivia a couple of weeks ago, where people who are living in the slums took to the streets to demonstrate, saying we are as equally at risk on the streets as we are where we are living.
Yeah.
And I think there are issues to be addressed there. But it also raises the question, which I've raised several times in other interviews, and the thing that I've been really struck by was Arundhati Roy's essay on Portal, and she is arguing that that this is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next.
Yeah,
and that portal, the outcome of that is not something that is predetermined. There is a subjective factor.
Yeah.
What are we able to do to counter those who inevitably seek to use this crisis as a shock doctrine, as a way of furthering their own interests?
Well, of course they're going to do that. They'll do that with any opportunity they get.
But we should do that with every opportunity we
get. Yeah. What I think one of the things that I'm finding different this time.
Yeah.
I've always been an organizer. I remember being described once as the little fire engine that started running as soon as the bell went off. But
What a perfect description of you.
well, it's not anymore, because the reality is I can't do that. I can't go out. I can't go out and organize in the way I always organized, which was bringing people together and talking over a meal and hugging each other and running around and being there. I'm old and I'm vulnerable. And so I don't know, like, sure, I could go do that and then I'll probably die. Like, I'm going to die within a couple of weeks. So what I think it's very challenging for older activists to figure out how you can be most effective in this. In fact, what it does is it tends to really, really marginalize us from any role in what's got to happen. I think what Arundhati Roy is talking about is absolutely right on. There's been some really, really good writing, and you've interviewed some amazing people on this program. But the role that us older activists, especially older white folks like me, can play in this thing are limited, I think. You know, I'm happy to chat with anybody who wants me to talk, but that's about all I can do now. And I find that, well, it drives me nuts, actually, but that's it, you know. So we can provide analysis, but I don't, you know, I think it's going to be up to a whole different generation to figure out what you do with this, how you organize in the face of this. Because it's not my world anymore. I don't know it. And I do understand very well how power works. And I can see how their tentacles are in the discourse, they're in the governance, they're in the divisiveness, the militarization. I can see all that. But I'm not, I do think that the only thing that's going to change it is the building of alternatives and the creation of a mass movement demanding that we move in a different direction. But I don't, quite frankly, have an awful lot to offer about how that happens.
But whatever our age, surely we can't let go of hope.
Oh, well, hope is a very different thing than optimism. Elizabeth May has always said that dandelions push up through sidewalks, so you can't give up. And frankly, when I look at the young Indigenous leadership, and I think, and people in other countries who are risking their lives around this stuff, I think I don't have any right to give up hope. I live in such privilege, and and despair will only feed the things that are destroying them. I mean, we have a responsibility to be hopeful.
Yeah. But I think, you know, we need to find out. We need to have discussions with those who are organizing. And I think that is going on. I cannot believe it. And it's one of the fundamental, the distinguishing feature of humans is that they are constantly engaged in a struggle for freedom, for emancipation, and that never stops. And it may be crushed at times, it may be difficult at times, but I think we need to find a way of connecting. And I think conversations with those who are, because they have no alternative but to engage, is something that where we have the possibilities of learning.
I agree completely, Feroz. And the kind of work you're doing with these interviews is really important.
It's well, but I do want to emphasize to people who are watching that you know your book represents, I think, an extraordinary achievement in that over those many decades you brought together what you have learned, what you have listened to, and I think that comes across very powerfully, and that's something I would say thank you for taking the time to put that together. I know how hard it must have been. I don't know how hard it was, but really. But it's a really important initiative that you've done. I think we would be remiss not to say it's thank you for doing that.
Well, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
and thank you for joining us on this show, Joan. It's a real
Well,
privilege to have you with us.
thank you for the interview.
You're very welcome. I'm sure we will talk again soon.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, those who are watching, please remember Unearthing Justice. Here's Joan promoting her great book, and it's published by Between the Lines in Canada, in Toronto. And I'd encourage you to get online and order your copy as soon as you can before it all runs out. Joan, thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Feroz.
Uh, Thank you for all of you for joining us on this show. This afternoon, we'll be talking to somebody who has been writing a great deal about the nature of racism in the US, and so we will be discussing those issues with Josh. Please join us later on this afternoon or this evening, depending on your time zone. And for the moment, this is Feroz Manji from Daraja Press signing off. And thank you for joining us here on Organizing in the Time of COVID.